If you're wondering which is the best camera to choose for shooting video between the Panasonic G9 Mark II and the LUMIX S5IIX, you've come to the right place. The S5IIX is currently the top tier full frame camera from Panasonic, but the G9 Mark II is arguably the best camera Panasonic has ever produced. So this will no doubt get interesting. And we're just going to make believe that this S5 Mark II is a G9 Mark II because I had to give it back. Either way, these cameras are awesome cameras and you can't go too far wrong with either. They're both exceptional when it comes to shooting video. The first major difference between these two cameras is that the G9 Mark II is a micro four thirds sensor camera, while the S5IIX is a full frame sensor camera. Each sensor has its own advantages and disadvantages, which we'll cover throughout this video. Alright, let's cover autofocus. So as you're no doubt already aware, Panasonic released their first phase detection camera, finally with the S5 Mark II, and they put that same great phase hybrid autofocus into their S5IIX and G9 Mark II. But the G9 Mark II has more advanced tracking options, including animal eye autofocus, car and motorcycle options as well. It tracks just about anything. A yellow box will come up and you'll see it track on screen. The autofocus for video is excellent on the G9 Mark II, whether you're talking to the camera in a situation like this, filming someone else, or tracking a car or animal. The S5IIX autofocus is also great. I've found the subject tracking almost flawless and a step ahead of my Sony FX3 at a distance. Pairing the much newer L-mount Lumix lenses with the S5 Mark II or X, the autofocus works great, and it's arguably more reliable than some of the older micro four thirds lenses for the G9 Mark II. The major advantage of the S5 Mark II X is the lens lineup. Each of the S series of primes shares the same newer generation of lens technology, allowing the autofocus to be as responsive and as snappy as I've ever seen. Now, fingers crossed that Lumix will put some of the advanced vehicle and animal tracking options from the G9 Mark II into the S5 Mark II and X in a future firmware upgrade. So, fingers crossed. Over to dynamic range. So dynamic range is how much information is captured in the entire scene, both in the highlights and shadows. And this is measured in stops. Now, one of the two small downsides of micro four thirds is that it doesn't generally capture as much dynamic range as a full frame sensor. And when comparing these cameras, this is still the case. The image out of the G9 Mark II is exceptional either way, allowing for up to 13 plus stops of dynamic range when shooting with the full version of Vlog that comes pre-installed in the camera. If you're coming from the original GH5, there's also an additional stop of dynamic range compared with that camera, and it will hold onto the highlights a whole lot better. On the other hand, the S5 Mark IIX can capture up to 14 plus stops of dynamic range thanks to this big juicy full frame sensor here. So it does a great job at giving you more information in the highlights and shadows. So full frame definitely has the advantage when it comes to dynamic range, but this isn't the only deciding factor, and we'll talk more about that throughout this video. Alright, over to low light performance. So another one of the limitations with micro four thirds is its low light performance. While the G9 Mark II does a solid job up against APS-C cameras like the Sony FX30, it's not on the same level as the S5 Mark II or X. The full frame sensor and the dual native ISO works wonders in a low light situation. You can shoot comfortably up to 12,800 or beyond and still get really usable footage, while I wouldn't normally go above 2,000 on the micro four thirds cameras. Now, the G9 Mark II does a decent job up to about ISO 3200, but I wouldn't push it any more than that. For those who plan on using either camera in a studio like this, they'll both give you excellent results, as I've never had my ISO above 200 in any given situation like this. When it comes to color science, shooting in the natural picture profile is very similar on both cameras. It's almost like Panasonic made the G9 Mark II to be interchangeable with the S5 Mark II. Any small differences can easily be corrected in camera or in post-production. When I first got my hands on the S5 Mark II, I felt like it ran a little too hot in the magenta compared with the original S5 or other cameras from Panasonic, but this has been fixed in a firmware update, and I love all of the color science out of both of these cameras. The only Lumix camera I've used with slightly better color science is the GH6, which has by default at least a more saturated mid-tone look, which makes the skin tones really pop. The great news is, whether you're shooting in Vlog or with any of the standard picture profiles, you can get these cameras to match beautifully with very little effort. Let's cover the recording modes, codecs, and options. So the G9 Mark II and S5 Mark IIX are very similar in codecs and recording modes. Both cameras can record up to 5.7K with a 17:9 aspect ratio or even higher in open gate. The main difference between them is shooting in the open gate option. Due to the aspect ratio of your typical micro four thirds sensor, open gate is shot with a 4:3 aspect ratio with a maximum resolution of 5.8K. On the S5 Mark II and X, you can film at a higher 6K resolution with a 3:2 aspect ratio. Hilariously, the original G9 was a photocentric hybrid camera. It's a great camera, but Panasonic went all out with the G9 Mark II, loading it up with all of the great features of the S5 Mark II X, including Apple ProRes, all intra recording, MOV, and MP4 options. The G9 Mark II takes the lead with the higher frame rates, being able to shoot up to 120 frames per second in 4K. With the 4K 120p aside, these are almost identical in the menu system, so either or both a really great choice for shooting video. Additionally, both cameras allow you to record out to an external SSD in both video and photo mode. This is especially useful for long recordings or when you're using some of those high data rate codecs like Apple ProRes. Since a recent firmware upgrade, both cameras can now fully support raw external recording via their full-size HDMI port. And if you want to do some serious filmmaking and use some anamorphic lenses, both cameras have the same built-in preview and de-squeeze options. The only tool I couldn't find on the G9 Mark II that's built into the S5 Mark IIX is the synchro scan option, but other than that, they're basically identical in terms of their menu. Like most modern LUMIX cameras, neither camera has any recording limit, which is awesome. This is a welcomed upgrade over the original G9 Micro Four Thirds camera and, of course, the original S5 full-frame camera, which had recording limits in the 10-bit modes. Over to in-body image stabilization, or IBIS. So the in-body image stabilization on both of these cameras is insane. The Panasonic S5 Mark II and X have better IBIS than most Micro Four Thirds cameras, offering up to 6.5 stops of image stabilization. This is a step up even over the GH5, GH5 Mark II, or the GH6 in some cases. For a full-frame sensor camera, it's unbelievable. For handheld shooters wanting the best full-frame sensor stabilization, the S5 Mark II and X are on a whole other level. And then the G9 Mark II arrived. The G9 Mark II gives you up to 8 stops of IBIS that delivers almost GoPro action camera results in an interchangeable lens camera system. The in-body image stabilization on the G9 Mark II is easily the best on the market, even being more stable than the S5 Mark II and X. The standard modes are impressive enough, but Panasonic added 2 active modes, which makes the footage look like it's been run through some gyroscopic software. The end result is the best straight out of camera stabilized footage I've ever seen from any camera system. For handheld shooters looking for the best of the best, the G9 Mark II is the way to go. That said, without the active digital crop modes enabled on the G9 Mark II, the results are very similar and both will give you excellent IBIS for handheld shooting. I'm really hoping that Panasonic can incorporate some of those active modes found on the G9 Mark II into the S5 Mark II and X at some point in the future through a firmware upgrade. Rolling shutter performance is another benefit to Micro Four Thirds, and it clearly has less rolling shutter artifacts over the S5 Mark IIX. Rolling shutters where if you do a quick whip pan from side to side, for example, you'll see the image distort diagonally or worse. One of the biggest complaints that some people have about the S5 Mark IIX is the rolling shutter performance in full frame mode. While I haven't found this to be an issue for what I do, if you do a quick whip pan from side to side, you will see it. APS-C crop mode on the S5 Mark II improves the performance of the rolling shutter, but the Micro Four Thirds sensor gets the win. We get a faster readout speed paired with a smaller sensor, giving us better end results when it comes to rolling shutter. So we get less of it with the smaller sensor. So the win goes to the G9 Mark II. When it comes to overheating, both the S5 Mark IIX and the original S5 Mark II have never let me down out in the field. I've shot with these cameras out in the Australian summer and have had no issues with warnings or shutting off thanks to the active cooling fan. Now the G9 Mark II doesn't have an active cooling fan, so unlike the GH6, it can overheat when shooting 4K at 120 frames per second for 18 minutes and above. In all other frame rates and resolutions, I had no issues with the G9 Mark II overheating. Much like the original GH5 and the GH5 Mark II that have passive heat sinks, the G9 Mark II does a remarkable job at dissipating heat and keeping things up and running. Long story short, you won't have any issues with the G9 Mark II shooting 4K at 120 frames per second for shorter duration clips or when shooting 4K 25, 50 or 60p. You can just let it run all day. All right, let's wrap this video up. I'm gonna give you my final thoughts on which camera is best and why, but it's a bit of a complicated answer. For those who want the best image quality for the standard frame rates like 24, 25 or 30p, get the S5 Mark IIX. The image quality is superb and the low light performance and increased dynamic range gives this camera the win. Alternatively, if you need 4K at 120 frames per second and don't want any additional crops, and you want the best in-body image stabilization system I've ever seen, then get the G9 Mark II. As of shooting this video, Panasonic don't actually offer 4K at 120 frames per second on any of their full frame cameras. And if you're editing on a 4 or 5K iMac, for example, the increased resolution out of the G9 Mark II shooting 4K at 120 frames per second over 1080p at 120 frames per second is very apparent. The image quality out of the G9 Mark II gets the win in that case. Now, alternatively, if you're happy just shooting 4K at 50 or 60 frames per second with an APS-C crop, then the S5 Mark II or X would be my choice. You can still get excellent image quality out of this, even with that APS-C crop, but that can be a deal breaker for some people. And if you've got your heart set on 4K 120, the G9 Mark II will be the way to go. If you can do me a quick favor, leave a thumbs up if this video has been helpful or it's helped you decide on which camera to buy. I'll leave some affiliate links to both cameras down in the description so you can check it out in your part of the world. Both of these cameras are fantastic and they work not only great as an A or B camera, but they also complement each other beautifully. So if you've already got a full frame camera, you're looking for a micro 4/3 camera or vice versa, you can't go too far wrong with either of these. Thanks for watching. Drop a thumbs up if you can. These videos take forever to put together, and I will catch you on the next one. Catch you soon.